Your mic's not working.
Jim, talk loud.
It is now.
There we go. Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody. Appreciate y'all being here. Item 1, approval of the agenda.
Motion for the agenda. Second.
All righty. Did you get that? All righty. We got a motion and a second to approve the agenda. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Approval of the minutes of July 10th.
Motion to approve the minutes.
Second.
All right. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Director report, tip update.
At the last meeting, we talked about, presented a proposal to you about advanced construction for capital transportation projects, and told you we'd have a meeting with city managers, administrators, and finance people. We held that meeting, and there's a lot of good exchange, but no decision was made. What was determined that we would develop a model policy and distribute that back to that group and have them provide us with comments on the model to see how much further it would go and then bring it back. We also made a determination that we would like to take this to the TAC to get their input on this as well, since they're going to be the technical advisors to you all. Also, AGH, Alan Gibbs and Hewlett has started work on the single audit and financial statements for the 2017 budget year. They're also aiming for completion of the work prior to the September 30th, 2018 contract deadline, and that will also meet the terms that was set by KDOT and FHWA and FTA. On your places there, we also put a flyer for an event called Parking 2.0. That'll be next Tuesday, August 21st, and it's scheduled for the Wichita Art Museum from 5:30 to 7:30. Jeff Tumlin is a nationally recognized planning expert. Will discuss how parking affects communities on multiple levels, including public health, economic strength, and transportation connections, and you're all welcome to attend that. So, and that's all I have.
Questions for Bill? All righty. Consent agenda. Christian, walkability consultant contracts.
I had just.
You have something under his report also? Oh. Go for it.
Okay. Just here for your sort of your standing update on where things are at with our Wampo funding cycle that's taking place this year. So as you know, we carry this cycle out every 2 years. We did it last in 2016, and so it's time to do it this year. And this is where Wampo awards are approximately $12 million per year in federal funding to a new batch of projects. So this year we are awarding projects to be let for construction in 2021 and 2022. And this is really an opportunity for Wampo to partner with local governments in the region to help us move forward to implement the long-range transportation plan, or MOVE 2040. So here's an update on where we're at. We've gone through soliciting projects. We've received 15 applications. We've gone through the screening process, wrapped up the public input process that took place just a little over a month. We had a month for public input opportunity. Oops. And then now, as you can see from the calendar, we're at the project selection phase. So this is where we've your former chairperson appointed a 5-person committee, and they've been tasked with reviewing all the applications, going through the rating process, hearing presentations from the applicants, and ultimately will make a funding recommendation for this board to consider in terms of what projects to fund during this cycle. So we're just getting that wrapped up. We have a few loose ends. We'll be here at your meeting next month to present that formal, their official recommendation. But in the meantime, we wanted to share just a few of the really good things that came out of both the project selection process and this public input phase. So for now, I'm going to ask my colleague Tricia Thomas, our communications director, to come and share with some of the good things that came out of our public input phase.
Thanks. Hey guys, so there's a handout, it's a little packet, it looks like this, it says candidate projects. If you take a look at that, the first 3 pages are a summary of basically what we did to get the word out about these projects. This was something kind of new we haven't done before. We basically created online surveys, which I think I showed you in a previous meeting online, where people could see a picture and a map and go in and give their opinion or their perception about each one of the projects. And we had a lot of interest, a lot of comments. I listed below here, we have had about 192 comments total. The Sedgwick County project, Keachai project, and Hayesville in that order received the most interest. On the pages, well, that page and then the next 2 pages, I just tried to do a theme or a summary of the comments that we received. And you'll see for those 3 projects that I mentioned, the Sedgwick County Pedestrian Bridge, the Hayesville North Main reconstruction, and the Keachai intersection, because there were so many comments, I pulled out categories of comments, and you'll see them listed there. So like on page 2, you see 17 comments that reference flooding. So those aren't 17 individual comments. Those are how many times did somebody talk about the flooding issue. So if you're trying to add those numbers up and not getting the right total, that's why it looks like that. So, and then at the back, this is just all the comments we received. And these all came in either through email or through the actual survey. I even went on to some of your jurisdiction Facebook pages and pulled off the comments because the survey was shared there, but they were commenting there instead of going to the survey. So I tried to get everything, and it was really kind of cool to see everybody become engaged. I went out to the Hayesville night out and people were talking about it, telling me about it. So it was really kind of cool. And I was going to read you some of these comments, but I think you should flip through. There's some really compelling stories about personal experience with safety in some of these areas. But if anybody has questions, I'm happy to answer. Or I can start reading them. Oh, good.
Thanks, Tricia. And then I just had 3 additional things that I wanted to share with this group in terms of really good things that were coming out of this project selection process. The first had to do with how much we learned about the projects and how well the projects, these proposed projects, were responding to real needs and real issues in terms of where they're being proposed. So, for example, one project was on 61st Street North through Park City. This is an area that's in recent years really industrialized in terms of lots of warehouses coming in. And when that road was originally put in, I think by the county, it was a much more rural area. The road was put to more rural standards. And through the course of developing this project, some data was collected in terms of how much truck traffic was driving on this road. And it turns out it was 90% of the vehicles driving down the road were trucks. And the average on most streets is 15%. So, it was a chance to really see how this corridor that was going through here needed to be upgraded to support the changing land use around it. We also saw that in a project on Andover along 159th Street, where there's a lot of residential suburbanization happening, and that, again, where the road was put in had been more to rural standards, and the project would propose to upgrade it to more urban standards with curb and gutter and more of an arterial design. So those are a couple good examples of how the committee and our staff got an opportunity to learn about some of the specifics about these projects and the needs they were meeting. We also got to learn about some of the safety issues. One project, along Mount Vernon, there had been 250 accidents had happened there over the last several years. One was a fatality, several serious injuries. And the project that's being proposed there incorporates many, many safety features that are designed to mitigate some of this safety issues. So that was one of the really good positive things that came out of this process, was to see how these projects were really meeting a need and really meeting issues that were coming up in these particular locations. The second exciting thing to come out of this had to do with the amount of coordination that was taking place between jurisdictions. I want to highlight a couple projects here. One was in Valley Center on Meridian, coming south out of Valley Center, and then one was on Hayesville on their North Main Street, which is the Seneca alignment going north out of Hayesville. On both of these projects, after they were presented to the committee asked the communities to go back and work with Sedgwick County to try to extend these projects to make them for a better project to go past their city limits. So in both cases, the projects had been proposed to stop at the city limits, and after some conversations, they were able to work with Sedgwick County to be able to extend the projects and make it for an even better project. So these were just some really good examples of how through this process we can make better projects. As you know, the traveling public doesn't just stop at jurisdictional limits, and so it was a great opportunity to coordinate on these. And then the last thing I wanted to bring to your attention was just the really rich level of conversation and questions about this topic of regional significance. This committee was really sort of talking about things like, well, you know, what sorts of projects does Wampo want to spend its money on, or what projects seem more local that maybe the local government should pay for, or more statewide that the state should participate in. And they talked about lots of different aspects of this. You know, is regional significance where is that where projects that require coordination between multiple jurisdictions? You know, maybe a project on a jurisdictional line. Is that what that means? Or is it projects that connect communities when no connection had been there before, or improve the connection in some way? Or maybe regional significance has more to do with common issues that are faced by many different communities, or projects that address these socio-demographic trends we've been talking about. Maybe they're large-scale highway and highway interchange projects that have lots of traffic volumes, or maybe they're projects that address multiple goals. So as you all know, this has been a topic of conversation that this board has grappled with. It did continue on with this committee, and I'm sure it will continue as we go into work for the update to our long-range plan. So I just wanted to share some of this with you today, so you could kind of have a sense of what the committee was working with, and some of the things, really positive things that came out of this process. I'm glad to answer any questions on that. And then I have one additional, just small tip update. You might have noticed this report at your desk. It's called Federal Safety Performance Measures. This is a report that our staff put together, mostly Chris Upchurch. I want to thank him for putting it together. This is a new requirement. We are, in the last federal legislation, requires MPOs to start reporting on how well we're doing on meeting our performance targets for these different performance measures. You probably remember Chris coming up for several months to ask you to take action on setting targets for different performance measures, whether they be safety or congestion or different topics. And this is some of the first data that's coming out of that. So this one just focuses on safety. You'll see there's numbers in here for how well we're doing on fatalities, fatality rates, serious injury rate, those sorts of things. And I am happy to say that we're on target to meet our performance targets for the region on these areas. We are waiting for some data to come to be made available to complete the data set. But for the data we have, we can definitely say we're on target. And then the last part of the report talks about the projects that are in our TIP and how those, either the location of the project or the features of the projects, help us to meet these safety goals. So just wanted to draw your attention to this. This will be a report that we'll be including in our TIP as we move forward. So this is just the first time, and just wanted to draw your attention to it. Glad to take any questions you might have. Thank you.
Now we'll go to the consent agenda.
Chair, make a motion we approve the consent agenda.
Second.
Tom and Ann to approve the consent agenda. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, motion carried. Item 3, public comment. Anybody like to address the board at this time? Moving on, new business, scenario planning. Chris?
Planning considerations.
Pardon me?
Comment on
Okay.
Number 4.
What does that mean?
Well, we were very pleased that we were included in the transportation or the marketing planning, but, and that Wampo on the Planning Walkable Places program, and it generated in Mays. And I guess we know that there are other cities involved that are also excited about the studies, but we're asking Phil if he would please, is it possible to have Wampo staff look at options for capital expenditures, ways to implement these studies? Because as we are finished with them, we don't want to put them on the shelf, but that's what happens sometimes. Thank you.
Christian, isn't that part of our next tip with the planning consultant, or is that, what was that on? Not walkability, but, or Chris? What's the consultant money? That's for projects, is it?
Yeah, I can address this a little bit. In sort of at a high level, the place to move these planning walkable places projects from planning studies sort of into the next phase would be as we develop our next metropolitan transportation plan, which we're starting now and will take place over the next 2 years. One of the things Wampo asked for some money for in the current TIP funding cycle that Kristen talked about, you two, and I think this is what Dan was mentioning, is we asked for some, to use some of our federal funding to hire a consultant that would work with our member jurisdictions to help develop projects and scopes and cost estimates to be submitted for the next MTP. So to give you guys, all the jurisdictions, some assistance in making sure you can put your best foot forward when it comes to projects that you'd like to be funded as part of our next long-range plan. I think that's what Dan was referencing. So that sort of at the high level is what the next step for implementing some of these planning walkable places projects would be. I'll also say, and this is very preliminary, staff have been having internal discussions about essentially how we want to handle the sort of smaller bike ped projects as part of the MTP development, and some discussions about exactly how that's going to shake out. So I think the fruits of those discussions would be responsive to your requests that you made there.
What about the time frame? When?
So the time frame we're looking at is we would be calling for projects to be part of the next MTP around the middle of next year, and then evaluating them. The next MTP gets adopted in 2020, and we're looking at ways to start getting those projects, you know, into the implementation phase as soon as possible after that.
Thank you.
Any other planning consideration, comments, or discussion? Okay, go ahead, Chris, with the scenario planning presentation.
Scenario planning, thank you. So up here today to talk about scenario planning. We've had a scenario planning effort ongoing for some time. And this effort is really built around the idea of asking, what are the possible futures for the Wampo region? For those not familiar with scenario planning, it might help to sort of contrast this with the old-fashioned approach to planning. And in that old-fashioned approach, a professional planner, someone like me, would take a lot of data and considerations and pour it into some sort of model, and we'd run the model, come up with some output, and we say, this is what the future will be. A couple of problems with that. First off, it turns out we're not really that good at actually predicting the future. Second, and maybe a little less obvious, is that tends to push your planning towards questions that the model can answer. And the questions that the model addresses may not be the questions that are most important or most interesting to members of the public. So the idea behind scenario planning is, rather than trying to come up with one future based on this model, that we look at a range of possible futures and try and build our planning efforts, our plans around the idea of addressing many of these different possibilities. So scenario planning fits into our transportation planning process. Now, the backbone is the MTP, the Metropolitan Transportation Plan. That's Move 2040 that we adopted a few years ago. And underneath that umbrella of Move 2040, we have various plans, things like our freight plan, our regional transit plan, the Planning Walkable Places program that was mentioned earlier. We also have programs like our TIP, again, that was mentioned earlier, and then sort of specific special initiatives like scenario planning. Now, the output of all of these sort of gets grouped together and becomes the input to the next Metropolitan Transportation Plan. And that's sort of the step that we're in now, where you see those arrows, the output of these other plans getting turned into the next MTP. So key elements of scenario planning. This is a very public engagement focused type of exercise. We don't want this to be staff driven. We want it to be driven by this board, by our stakeholders, by members of the public. So we did quite a bit of public engagement, used the results of that public engagement to build the scenarios. Right now, we're sort of in the analysis of the outcomes and implications. We're looking at these scenarios, including talking to you guys about them. And then the last step, as I mentioned earlier, is applying these lessons, applying this output to the development of the next transportation plan. So our scenarios are really built around the trends that we've been talking about for several years. Those of you who have been on this body for a while have heard plenty of lectures by guest speakers, plenty of presentations by Wampo staff talking about trends. And these are some of sort of the most important ones. Talking about social and demographic changes, the need for a regional identity, technological changes, financial uncertainty, economics and employment, and then land use. And what we've done in scenario planning is to take these trends and use them to do our public outreach and to elicit thoughts from members of the public, including members of this body, on what sort of things we should address in our scenarios. So the driving forces, the issues and challenges, the opportunities and areas of equity that we should look at. So we did, as I said, quite a bit of public engagement as part of this process. We went to many community meetings, talked to several hundred people, great range of ages and backgrounds. It included elected officials, including this body, stakeholders, members of the public. Got a lot of input. And just to briefly summarize, looking at the driving forces, we heard a lot about funding. That's a perennial topic, came up from quite a few different sources. The demographic trends I mentioned earlier, a lot of interest in active transportation and biking and walking, workforce demand and skills, the aging population, importance of maintaining good quality infrastructure, technological changes, regional image and economic development were important to folks, and finally sort of a cluster of driving forces around health and wellness. For the challenges, again, finance and funding was a major topic that came up. Lack of regional planning or a regional vision, which as a planner kind of cut me to the quick. Safety came up from a lot of folks. We had a lot of people concerned about that. Tricia mentioned some feedback we've been getting about that lately. Brain drain, this outflow of educated young people from our region, the limits of our current public transit system. Some disagreement between folks we heard in the more urban areas and the more rural areas on what they were looking for out of our transportation future. And a lot of folks who were not real happy with some of the stuff the state legislature has been doing lately. But it's not all gloom and doom. We do have some opportunities. Plenty of people mentioned the low cost of living in the Wichita area, the fact that our transportation system is pretty reliable. We have consistent travel times, both for commercial freight trips and for personal trips. A lot of folks thought Wichita State University offered good opportunities for this region, particularly their innovation campus and their recent partnership with the Wichita Area Technical College. Renewable energy, wind is big in Kansas, and bike ped infrastructure. And finally, talking about equity, again, public transit came up. Funding, there are some folks who don't like the way we're distributing funding right now, would like to see less spent on roads and bridges and more on some of these alternative modes. Distribution of transportation services in the region, sort of geographic equity. generally talking about our funding priorities, access to jobs and job training came up quite a bit. And finally, just transportation not being affordable for folks. So our philosophy in turning these driving forces and considerations and opportunities and equity into scenarios has been for staff to take a trend or a group of trends and sort of take them to their logical extreme. We're not necessarily saying, again, with this, that any of these futures is exactly the way it's going to happen, but we're seeing what happens if we push on a particular trend. What sort of future does that look like? And then we look across all of these scenarios to see what are the common elements, what are the particular things we should be preparing for. And finally, then we have one business as usual scenario, sort of as the baseline, as a baseline for comparison. So these are the 5 scenarios, and I just briefly wanted to go through and talk about each of them. So scenario 1, maintaining the current direction. This is our baseline scenario. It assumes the status quo continues, that we'll stick with sort of the preserve and maintain philosophy we had in Move 2040. Local governments will continue doing the sorts of transportation projects they've done in the recent past, and KDOT every 5 or 10 years will bless us with a major freeway project. But basically that the next 20 years are going to look a lot like the past 5 or 10 years did. So questions about our baseline scenario? Moving on to something a tad more interesting. Scenario 2 is what we're calling urban renaissance. And this is really built around some of the demographic changes, demographic trends that we've been talking about here and elsewhere over the past few years. We have our graying population. We're all getting older. But in particular, as the baby boomers are retiring, fewer of them are, packing up and moving down to Florida or Arizona. Many more are retiring here in the Wichita area, staying around, often to be near family. And that means that we're seeing a much larger slice of the population is over age 65 than we did in the past. On sort of the other end of the spectrum, as they age into the workforce, we're seeing a lot more millennials and Generation Z households. And the upshot of this, you have more of the empty nesters on one end and more of these younger folks who are waiting longer to get married or delaying having kids. We're seeing a lot more childless households. Single-person households or childless households are going to make up a much bigger proportion of our population in the future. And this is leading to some changing desires in how people want to live. Maybe if you're a childless household, the standard suburban house isn't quite as appealing. Maybe you want to live someplace denser, more urban, offers access to other transportation modes. So this scenario really embraces those trends. What happens if those are the things that are really dominant over the next 20 years? Well, in response to those trends, we'd expect to see land use to change, an emphasis on these more walkable urban neighborhoods. Not just sort of in the central Wichita core, but we'd also expect to see them developing in some of the more outlying cities, having their own sort of town centers in our suburban communities. And we're hoping that if we saw these changes, maybe that would ameliorate one of the negative trends that we've talked about, this brain drain, the outflow of educated young people. If we have more of these types of places where they could live, maybe they'd be less inclined to move out of the region. So what are the transportation impacts of these trends? Well, this is a scenario where fixed route transit does very well, not just to move people around within these denser urban areas, but also to spread outward and connect the town centers with the more central core. We're also going to need to choose transportation options that are appropriate for the surrounding land uses. Right now, when we look at our denser areas like downtown Wichita, we tend to think mostly in terms of moving people in the morning and moving them out in the afternoon as they come in to work and maybe to shop. But if these are places where people are living and playing in addition to working, we need to think about the transportation aspects differently. Maybe we want to look at things like complete streets policies, where we're trying to do a better job of accommodating bicyclists and pedestrians and transit. Flexibility in the type of projects we fund. We're looking at different projects in this sort of future than we might in the status quo scenario. And finally, as people get more concentrated, we also would want to concentrate our transportation investments in the areas where we can best serve them. So questions about the scenario 2, the urban renaissance. So scenario 3 is really built around that question of funding. As I mentioned, this is one that bubbled to the top repeatedly in our public outreach. And we've seen in the past couple of years a lot of uncertainty about state and federal funding. This scenario assumes that's not only going to continue into the future, but it's going to get worse. We're going to see shortfalls and decreases in funding at both the state and federal levels. And that in response, we'll see more leadership on transportation issues come at the local level from folks like you in this room, rather than us looking to Topeka or to Washington, D.C. to make transportation spending decisions. Also looking at increased demand for freight in this scenario. And sort of the hope is in a scenario like this that we would see some sort of new regional transportation funding mechanism, that as the state and federal governments might pull back, that locals would be willing to step up and fund more of our transportation needs. And in part that leads to more of an emphasis on moving freight. If our transportation funding is more intimately tied to our local economy, then it becomes even more important to make sure that economy keeps rolling. And freight is a big part of that. So how would we adapt transportation-wise to this? Well, a lot of importance on cultivating that regional leadership and cultivating regional identity. This entails a lot of cooperation between different jurisdictions in different areas. And when I say regional here, we're not just talking about the Wampo region. As you may be able to see on the map there, we've got the greater south central Kansas region colored in. That's the 9-county region that REAP and Bragg use for some of their work. So looking at this larger region and a regional identity for south central Kansas. This would also mean that major new capital programs would need to have a local commitment. You know, in this sort of future, we're not talking about 80% federal and 20% local. We're talking maybe 50-50 or maybe even majority local funding, maybe even big projects that don't have any federal funding attached at all. This is a lot of carrying our own weight here. And, you know, when we're spending local money, it makes it even more important to really concentrate on projects that have the biggest impact, that are going to bring the biggest dividends to our region and to our economy. So questions about scenario 3, local transportation investment. So scenario 4 also leans on the financial aspects, the shortfalls and uncertainties in state and federal transportation funding. But unlike the previous scenario, we aren't assuming that regional identity and that regional funding mechanism. This is really the scenario where we have to do less with less. Now, that's kind of a downer, but Wichita is actually in a way better positioned for a big reduction in transportation spending than some other places are. We've got a good amount of capacity on our roadways. That's part of the reason why we don't have a lot of congestion in the Wichita region. And we're also growing slowly. And while that's generally a negative, if we have less to spend on transportation, that could end up being a benefit. We're not like some of these areas like, say, Phoenix or Denver or Dallas, where they're already so far behind the curve and they're really trying to build their way out of these major capacity problems. We're, in a way, ahead of the curve, and the curve is not that steep here anyway. But this still isn't a lovely future for us here. Because, in part, that excess capacity can both be a burden to maintain and maybe an opportunity to pare things back. Maybe we have to look at what the most important parts of the system are to fund. If we have less money to go around, we have to do some prioritization. And like the previous scenario, freight becomes very important here because we are relying more on our local economic aspects. It's even more important to drive that economic development and spend on the highest priorities. So for transportation, again, it's about prioritizing economic development and freight. Also maybe looking at how we can repurpose existing infrastructure, how we can use it differently. And Phil's favorite example on this is George Washington Boulevard in sort of the southeast quadrant of Wichita. This is a facility that was built decades ago when a lot more people lived in the central core, and many of them worked down at the Boeing plant at McConnell Air Force Base. And at that time, this was a major artery. You have this nice 4-lane facility because you had a big flow of people from the sort of the eastern part of the Wichita core down to McConnell. If you go out there during rush hour today, you don't see a whole lot. And a lot of that's because the residential patterns have changed. You don't have nearly as many people living in that Wichita core. These days, the people who are working at Spirit tend to live in the further outlying areas of Wichita or out in suburbs like Andover, Hayesville, Derby, Goddard. So you don't see a whole lot of traffic on George Washington Boulevard. So maybe we don't need to maintain that as a big 4-lane facility. Maybe we can do something different with it. Cut it back to fewer lanes, use some of that asphalt for pedestrian facilities or bicycle facilities. Find some creative way of changing how we're using this in a way that would cost us less for maintenance. And finally, we tend to see a pattern, and I see it some here at Wampo, that someone comes in, a developer, they do some development, could be commercial or warehousing or residential. I think you actually heard a couple of these examples from Kristen, where they do the development and then the local jurisdictions need to come in behind them and say, okay, what do we need to do to the transportation infrastructure to support this development that's gone in? And that works all right when you do have sources of funding to accommodate that transportation investment on the back end. But in a future where we don't have nearly as much money, maybe we need to make some more of those decisions on the front end. Maybe we need to say, no, this probably isn't a great place for that development because it doesn't have the transportation infrastructure in place to support it. And that would be a real big change to the way we do business around here. But it might be the sort of things we have to think about if we have significantly less money in the future. So questions about scenario 4. Now on to one of my favorites, looking at technology as a driver for our transportation future. So I should emphasize that all of these scenarios do assume some level of technology, automated and connected vehicles. But in the other 4 scenarios, we're assuming those kind of remain the minority. They're a part of the vehicle fleet, but not dominant. In this scenario, we're assuming that automation and technology really takes off, that 20 years from now, they're going to be a majority of the vehicle fleet. The other technological change we're leaning on in this one is the trend towards remote work. People no longer needing to actually travel into the office to do their job. They can do it online and just sit at home in front of the computer. So the upshot of both of these in terms of transportation is that people no longer need to live as close to the place that they work. This is pretty obvious with remote work. You can live anywhere and don't have to go into your job. But with automated vehicles, we see some of the same forces at work. Maybe you do have to drive into for your job, whatever your particular job is, but rather than wasting your drive time, you can actually pop out the laptop and let the car drive itself and get started on your work even as you're driving in. So the drive to and from becomes part of the workday rather than a time suck the way it is now. Well, if we have those options, there's no longer as much incentive to live close to where you work. So we would expect urban sprawl, more far-flung development further from the city center. Other big shift that we see in this scenario is a shift towards mobility as a service. Now, we have mobility as a service even now without automated vehicles. This is services like Lyft and Uber. But if automated vehicles are dominant, we're not really expecting that most of those would be owned by individuals. Most of them would probably be owned by big companies. Could be Uber and Lyft, could be Google, could be the auto manufacturers. They'd own their own fleets of vehicles, and you'd pull out your phone and call up a vehicle that would come and pick you up. So this shift in car ownership also has a lot of implications for transportation. You don't need as much parking. Maybe you can do denser development because you don't need as many garages on individual houses. You don't need big parking lots at dense destinations. So sort of at the same time as we're seeing sprawl, people living further out, maybe they're also living closer together in these more far-flung communities, denser developments. Finally, this is the scenario that is very challenging for traditional transit. When they're competing with this mobility as a service, it means transit is really going to have to change significantly in order to remain relevant. It would look very different in a future like this than it does today. So what sort of transportation responses would we expect to have to make for a future like this? Well, one of the options here, once you get to a majority of automated vehicles, is you can start thinking about things like dedicated automated vehicle lanes. And if you have a travel lane that is just for automated vehicles, you can pack a lot more cars in there. They can run almost bumper to bumper rather than requiring more space in between them. And that probably ameliorates a lot of capacity problems and reduces the need for big new highway projects because you can pack more cars into existing roads. And so the implication of that is that transportation spending starts to look very different. We don't have as many big capital projects where we're putting a lot of money into asphalt and concrete and steel. But we don't really expect transportation spending to go down. We expect it to change. A lot more money going to technology, to fiber optics and radio communications, more going to ongoing maintenance. And this would have big implications for how jurisdictions like Wampo and how all of your individual jurisdictions fund transportation projects. Rather than thinking of a big investment up front and then a small ongoing maintenance cost, there would be less upfront cost and more ongoing maintenance to help keep up all of this technology. This is probably the most uncertain of all the futures. This is definitely the most speculative one. So there would be a big emphasis on flexibility in future transportation projects. Important to ask in projects we're building 5 years from now, how does this project work, 20 or 30 years from now when the transportation system might be very different? And finally, I think for this, it's important to start pilot projects early because the sorts of projects we'd be doing here are so different. Our first venture into connected vehicle projects, it would be much better if that were a $1 million project in the next few years rather than getting to the point where 10 years from now, we're spending $100 million. And that's our first experience with this very new, very different type of project. So early pilot projects are important there. Questions about scenario 5? So, next steps for scenario planning. We are in the process of sharing the results and the draft scenarios, including this presentation to you guys. So we're looking at evaluating these scenarios, identifying potential impacts. We want to gather feedback from all of you and all sorts of stakeholders. Which of these scenarios do you think is most likely, least likely, most important for us to prepare for? What have we left out? What should we emphasize more? What can we do to get the best use out of these scenarios? And then once we've done that public engagement, we'll be coming back to you as part of the development of our transportation plan and talk about what we've learned and how these scenarios and the feedback on them can inform the development of our next plan and our plan for the next 20 years. So I would love to hear any feedback you guys have on these scenarios.
Site? Richard?
I say all of the above. I mean, I think, maintain the current system, the status quo. Well, things are going to change, so it's not going to be exactly the status quo, but we have a lot of investment on a lot of roads there that aren't, quite frankly, going away, and you can make the argument we're struggling to keep up with what we have, so we still need to do that, but there's these scenarios that you proposed, there'll probably be a certain amount of each of those that will be piled on top of that. You'll have some pluses and minuses, and so I personally, when I look at it, I don't think you can really just say, well, just one of these. It's going to be what we have now, and then a bunch of other stuff that's going to be coming along.
Yep.
Anything else? Not. Thank you, Chris.
All right, thank you.
Alrighty, Transportation Plan Amendment 6.
I think you
got
skipped
something
one
else,
there.
Chris? Oh, I'm sorry. 2040 move, Amendment 4.
Yes, and now for something completely different. So, Move 2040 Amendment Number 4 is pretty simple. It involves one project, the Meridian Pedestrian Bridge. There we go, right to the notes. So this project may sound familiar to some of you. It's been through the process before. This is a pedestrian bridge across the Big Ditch at Meridian Avenue. The current highway bridge there, it's actually 4 lanes squeezed onto what originally was a 2-lane bridge. It means there's no shoulder, no sidewalk. It's, not great for bicyclists and downright hostile for pedestrians. This project would build a separate pedestrian bridge parallel to the existing highway bridge, help connect up some of the residential neighborhoods, especially going up to the campus high school on the north side of the Big Ditch, providing connectivity there where right now, if you're a pedestrian, you'd have a really circuitous route to get around between those two. Now, this project was originally in the tip for construction in 2017. But when Sedgwick County let the project out for bid, the bids came in much, much higher than they had anticipated. And Sedgwick County, which would have been responsible for the additional cost, chose to pull the project rather than proceeding with it. Now, as part of our current TIP funding cycle that Kristen talked to you about a little earlier, Sedgwick County put this project back in, asking for funding in 2021 with a higher funding amount that would reflect the increased cost they saw when they put it out for bid. And I'll note that during our public engagement on this, this project got more responses from the public than any of the other projects we had out there. So this is one that has received a lot of interest from members of the public. There's a big interest in this project. Now, the reason I'm here for this, rather than us waiting around for the next TIP update, is that this year we have a very substantial amount of end-of-the-year funds available. We've talked about these before. We have kind of a standard way of dealing with this. Last year we used some of those funds for the Planning Walkable Places projects. We've used it for some transit stuff and some technology stuff. And this year our plan was to rely mostly on the technology projects to absorb this money, but it's actually such a substantial sum that KDOT and the city of Wichita were having some difficulty adequately absorbing the amount of money. So what Sedgwick County came to us and proposed is using some of that money to build this Meridian Pedestrian Bridge project. Now, usually we have a hard time using these end-of-the-year funds for capital projects because the KDOT project development process takes 2 to 3 years. We're sort of in a unique position here because this project has already been through that process, got all the way through the process to the point of going out for bid. So a lot of that background work has already been done on this, so we can get this project spun up and committed fairly quickly. So Sedgwick County and KDOT have indicated that it is possible for us to get this project to the point it needs to be by the end of the federal fiscal year, at the end of September. So we have this unique opportunity here. Commissioner Howell requested an amendment to Move 2040 that would make it possible for us to spend these end-of-the-year funds on this project and get this up and running, funded this fiscal year and probably built during calendar 2019, rather than waiting until 2021. So satisfy all these people who were very interested in it when we went out for public comment. I should note on this, I was down in Hayesville at their city council meeting last night, presenting this project to them. And the council down there not only passed a resolution supporting the project, but also voted to explore contributing some of the local funding share for this project alongside Sedgwick County. So they're definitely very interested in getting this project built, and it seems to be a big priority down there. So the amendment itself is fairly simple. It would basically update the costs associated with this project to reflect what we saw when Sedgwick County put it out for bid last year. And it would add additional Wampo funding to get it up to the standard 80% federal share. Now, I should note that the way the amendment is written is it solely relies on end-of-the-year funds for that. So adding the additional Wampo money to this project would not affect anyone else's capital project in this year or in future years. So that's the overview of the amendment. This went to the TAC at their last meeting, and they voted to recommend this to the policy body. So we are looking for action from the policy body on this one today. Happy to answer any questions.
Can you share with us the financial numbers on this project? I see it's in our deal, or I can share it.
Oh, sure. The project is about a little under $4 million, and the Wampo funding share would be a little under 3. So let's see, yes. Yeah.
Moving this project up, so we're talking about a pedestrian bridge for $4 million.
Yes.
And the theory is that we've moved deobligated funds up a year,
So we have a,
advanced a year, whatever you
yeah,
want to call
we
it.
have an unusually large amount of deobligated funds this year. And like I said, we've exhausted most of our usual ways of dealing with those funds. We've essentially paid off all of the advanced construction projects we can pay off this year. There's very little of that left to move funds from this year to next year. We are not doing planning walkable places this year, so that's not an option. And we were planning to take care of this with technology projects, but as I indicated, we're kind of saturating what KDOT and the city of Wichita could absorb on technology projects this year. So that's kind of how this came about as an alternative.
Does that create financial room for the next years, since we're moving this up
Yes, what it would do is,
to the tune
since well,
of $1 million?
assuming this project went through the TIP process and was funded, which is not something Wampo has committed to do yet, but it's probably likely it would happen if we don't do this project this year, that it would be funded in 2021, and there would be approximately this amount of money on that project in 2021. If we do it with the end of the year funds this year, we would free up that funding in 2021. And we would probably use that funding there to move projects forward from 2022. Then that would leave us additional funds in 2022 that we would program next time we do a TIP funding cycle. So we would ask for new projects, probably new projects developed as part of our next MTP, to get built in 2022. So the upshot of this is it would free up a good amount of money in 2022 for new projects, but because they haven't been developed yet, I can't exactly point to you which projects those would be at this point.
So the new projects, potentially, they have to fend for themselves on filling in that gap in the future years?
Yeah, what we would,
Rating.
this is not finalized, but what staff have been talking about doing is we would, as part of the development of our next MTP, we would use this money that's been freed up in 2022 to get some of those MTP projects funded a little earlier. You know, before we've been talking about the first projects that come under the new MTP wouldn't happen until 2023. This would allow us to move a few projects, maybe even just one project, up to 2022 and start implementing the priorities of the new long-range plan a little sooner.
Discussion we had during the project selection committee was this happens to be a project that's shovel ready, that we have funding that's available, that we wouldn't have to try and come up with some of the things we did last year, you know, when we couldn't roll that money. So it, yeah, anyway. But that way, this would give us, with the money that we're spending, and if it moves up like we're being suggested, that would give us into that 33-month time frame where we can bring projects forward and move something that's further back up instead of this. So the discussion, and it was preliminary discussion by our group that was there, the project selection committee, was this would be a good use of money available without coming up with additional consulting money.
Right, or studies or things like that.
Exactly.
So, or
I
do
said
we
this is
just,
also the project,
Excuse me, were you done, Pete? I'm sorry.
oh, that's right, go ahead.
say this is also the project got pulled last year that allowed us to fund all the bike ped studies that went on. And so they're asking that it be put back in, so it's not like it wasn't in there to start with.
And question on the, I understand where the funding's coming from and all that, but how is it determined? Regional significance, how is that determined, or was the parameters used to determine a project that is pedestrian walk for almost $4 million?
Hayesville with City of Wichita, South, I mean, there's a
How are
path
you
here and a
connecting them?
path here, and there was, that bridge is not, that's already spanning the, big ditch is not capable of putting pedestrians on it, so you've got a block there. And if we're trying to expand, bike and pedestrian, traffic as part of our regional goal, that's how it, that.
How is it linked to that, from
Yeah.
Wichita to Hayesville?
I believe there's a path
Uh,
on
maybe-
each side.
There's already a path there?
Yes. on
Just
both
seems like
sides.
Wampo is contributing 76% and Hayesville and the county 24% under this new finance. And I guess I understand regionalism, but I don't understand how is that amount of money being spent wisely for, and I know we have to spend it or we lose it, but I'm not sure being stewards of money to just spend it without,
True.
even though we're going to lose it, is always a
Well,
top
it's-
priority.
Since there
And
wasn't.
I'm new on this, so I
Right,
don't
no,
have
that's fine,
a
but
100, I don't have the background the rest of, some of them have, or
since
anything
it
like
did
that.
have a path on both sides, on either side of the big ditch that ended, that was where we felt that it connected with the regional aspect of it. So that's where that thought process was. Jim?
Yeah, I was just going to just describe the problem right now. The sidewalk that is north of 63rd Street headed towards Hayesville, it just dead ends. And on the other side of the Meridian Bridge, basically on the south side of that bridge going towards Wichita, the sidewalk just dead ends. And so consequently, there are people daily walking across that bridge, and it's not safe. We've had pictures of kids walking across that bridge. I know some people don't. There's a high school at 55th and Meridian, Campus High, and a lot of kids do drive to school, but there's still people who walk and bike to school, and it's not too far. But if you don't walk across this bridge, to make the same trek would be a 3-mile detour, and no one's going to do that. So they walk across this bridge unsafely. On top of that, I do think people would use this in terms of recreation, but I do think there's people who would walk to work and potentially bicycle to work. I mean, this is regionally significant, connecting two cities of our community. And it's something that's been talked about for a long time. It would have gone forward except for the cost got out of control. And now we just got a great opportunity. And I don't think there's a downside to this. I think this is the stars lined up. So at the appropriate time, I'd like to make a motion. We would approve the proposed amendment, but I'm not sure we're ready for that yet.
Yeah, yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, as I understand it, this is a project that's been through the ringer. It's been vetted. It's been approved in last year's TIP. It fell out because there wasn't enough funding at that point in time. It has met all the criteria for funding from Wampo. And with Commissioner Howell, I'd be happy to second a motion to move forward with this project.
Have a motion and a second, but we're going to still continue on with discussion. I haven't heard from this side of the table.
Mr. Chairman, I call the vote.
And I have one more comment. I think for the future of this policy body, Donna clearly questioned the regional significance, and it's got an element of that. And part of me says that all the reasons why we need to do this, but when we have clear conversations about the North Junction, regionally significant, and if we as Wampo are not focusing on our staff, on our TAC committee and others to have the North Junction ready for this kind of future deallocation of funds available for projects like that are are far regionally significant. Now, if we're just going to approve this and then next year we're going to fill in another gap on another project, we don't even have something on the project list right now that Troy and I are familiar with and Butler County and Sedgwick County are familiar with. As soon as Kellogg opens out east, it's going to dump a significant amount of traffic. There's already been wrecks at 143rd and Kellogg feeding into Andover, which is a community. Wichita is a community. Butler County is a community. Sedgwick County is a community. And that's not even on the list because we churn through this process of individual sub-regional projects that get elevated for funding. And we lose sight as a policy body on thinking the big picture, meaning North Junction, East Kellogg, maybe it's the acquisition of land on the west bypass or west Kellogg that's clear out by Goddard. And it bothers me, and I'm glad, Donna, that you pointed out at least questioning the regional significance. And it fits kind of, it fits a role, it obligates funds on previous projects, but until we change our staff and our TAC committee to think regionally, these are the kind of votes we're going to have in the future. And I think we do a disservice to our NPO in general by having these projects available to fill the gap. So I'm sorry for the lecture,
You
but
know, a year ago, I'd probably argue somewhat with you, but now that since we have a timeline where we aren't available to carry projects over, and we have nothing else in the pipe right now that has been presented that's shovel-ready, I think we're going to end up in a scenario, if we don't do something, where we were last October, and we came up with funding a multitude of studies on walkability places, and so
okay.
I don't see,
Dan,
I
I'm
think
with
your
you.
argument is,
I'm with you, but I think that
Right.
I think the policy body should also clearly direct the TAC under the TAC chair to reshuffle the deck and look at projects on a regionally significant impactual basis. I think KDOT and the feds will be very appreciative after sitting in your chair to see a more regionally significant application of funds. And I know it's not part of this vote, but I want to be on record with saying that. And if we're here a year from now and it comes up again, it's going to have a tough time getting my vote on any project.
we have been called for the question.
I'd have one question is, how can this be eliminated? I mean, this $3 million that we have, if we have all these needs, and are they just not getting through the process per se? Are they not, we're not submitting applications that are approved? I mean, $3 million is a lot of money to me.
A lot of projects have been deobligated, or like this one, the funding wasn't there for the bid that came in. That's one of the reasons why we're coming up with the advanced construction type policy is one way to do that. But we're also looking at other ways that we can have projects or programs prepared to where we don't have this scramble at the year end to do that. But we're working on that right now.
Okay, thank you.
Basically, what Pete was talking about is what we're trying to move towards, where we're going to have additional projects that could be available if, this scenario happens again, instead of, we're trying to get ahead of the curve at this point in time. Richard, you had something?
Yeah, I just want to say I agree 100% with everything that Pete Meitzner said. Make sure you write that down. I understand the project, but this is a lot of money for a pedestrian bridge, and we got to figure out a way to deal with this better than what we're doing. And
Okay, Tom?
I got a comment too and Pete's comment on North Junction. About 8 years ago, we went and put together, as this organization, put together a list of priorities, top 10 priorities in this area. And at that time, I'd recommended to North Junction, and I couldn't even get it in the top 5. And that's how things have changed. The state's gotten involved in it. Now it's a priority. So, but East Kellogg and West Kellogg got lots of attention, but we couldn't get North Junction in, and now all of a sudden it's getting attention. So it's just kind of getting in list and the line, and as we work out the stuff that's getting fixed on West Kellogg at 235, it comes up closer to the top. But at the time, we didn't even have money to do anything, and we went and put our priority out there on the 13th Street flyover and to get off of 235. We put it on the first interchange section of 235 and Kellogg. So we just have to take little bites because we didn't have any.
I
guess
get
you
all
would
that,
say.
but we got state people here, and are you telling me there's really, we got to be able to come up with an additional option? I mean, there's no other option. I mean, I know we're talking government, but there's got to be a way to make a better
We're
decision.
heading that way. All
Part of
right.
our problem is the ticket was $100 million. Nobody had $100 million. So it's just kind of like it just kind of got pushed down. So
Okay, we have a motion and a second to approve TIP amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Yes,
You're very loud, though. Today's conundrum is a structural conundrum. It's not a failure necessary of leadership or process at Wampo. It's a structural problem, and our friends at KDOT can explain that to us. But the bottom line is, we didn't have any choice but to find something to do with this money this year or to give it back. And staff, and I've been a part of some of these meetings, as have you, are looking for ways to get around this in the future in terms of how projects are selected, stuck into the pipeline, and the planning's done. So that hopefully this won't happen a year or 2 or 3 years from now.
okay. All right, anything else on that, Chris? I think we're good. All right. Going on to the 2017 TIP amendment number 6.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, well, good afternoon. I am here today with our TIP Amendment 6. Some of you might be wondering why this is not on your consent agenda, like usually these TIP amendments are because of their routine nature. We have this as a new business item for your consideration because of this action you just took on the MTP amendment regarding the Meridian Pedestrian Bridge. So that project is a part of this amendment, and we couldn't move forward with that until we knew what the vote was on the MTP amendment that you just took and passed. So that's why we're here today. So in addition to most TIP amendments that we have pretty routine sorts of project changes, this amendment does include a couple of non-routine things. One, again, is this Meridian Pedestrian Bridge as part of a bigger, this amendment handles or is programming what we're doing with our end of the year funding. And then, so let's go through that. So this amendment, we've got, we received requests to make changes to 17 projects. 10 of those projects require some sort of formal action by this committee to make official. The other 7 are more minor changes, things like changes in the year or minor scope changes, things like that. I would draw your attention to, do you have that handout? I would draw your attention to this attachment in your packet. It lists out all of the 17 changes, or the changes to the 17 projects that are part of this amendment. So we do require, if there's new projects that want to be added to the TIP or projects with significant scope or cost changes, to come before this board for your official approval for those sorts of things. And again, these smaller administrative scope changes or small dollar changes, we handle administratively. We do like to process all of these together as part of each amendment cycle, just to be transparent with our board, with our committees, and with the public, so that it's clear what all changes are being made to the projects in the TIP, big or little. So these are the 10 projects that I'll be going over today, these ones that are requiring your action. 8 of these are new projects. We've got 2 that are coming in under the Wampo funding end of the year balance, and then 6 that are coming in as other new projects to the TIP. And then we've got 2 modifications to currently programmed projects. So let's start with the ones that are probably of most interest to the board here today. This amendment is programming two projects that are coming in under the Wampo end of the year balance plan for this year. Like Chris mentioned in your item just before this, we have a sizable, we're estimating we have a pretty sizable end of the year balance, just right over 3.3 million. And that's, your TAC is recommending that these be split among two projects. Again, the first is the Meridian Pedestrian Bridge, which this committee discussed on their previous item. And the second project is the second one on here, the US 54 fiber project. This project will install fiber on US 54 Kellogg between Oliver and West Streets. And it will also run fiber through downtown Wichita all the way to the Traffic Management Center, which is the center located just north of us on Main Street, where the dispatch is operated and where all the camera feeds go to, and the which way Traffic Management Center is operated. So this is split about in terms of money. The Meridian Pedestrian Bridge is taking about 2/3 of this, and then the fiber project's taking the other third. It's the fiber project will cost a total of just over right around 1.5 million, and the Wampo funding will contribute just over $1 million to that. There are some other new projects that are being requested to add to our TIP. Most of these are pretty routine. You'll see these first three are KDOT projects to upgrade guardrails or do some bridge repair work on area highways on our region. Pretty routine work, and we very much appreciate KDOT taking care of our highways in our region. This fourth project, East Side Dynamic Message Sign, that's another KDOT project where they'll be installing those electronic signs for drivers at a couple locations on the east side. One is at Kellogg and right around 143rd Street East, and another one is at K96 and the Redbud Trail. This Wichita Transit project is a grant application that they're putting in to get a grant to purchase some replacement buses. And then I did want to draw your attention to this last item. It's a little bit non-routine. Many of you probably remember that we've had this asset management project in the Wampo TIP for the last couple years. It had $400,000 of Wampo funding associated with it. And we've had a really hard time sort of coming to consensus on what that project is, what it would be spent on, the scope of the project. So Wampo staff has proposed through this amendment process to split that into two separate projects. One would be called this Regional Asset Inventory that's listed here, and then we'd also have a second project called Asset Management Phase 2. So this first one, this Regional Inventory, would involve inventorying the condition of all of the regionally significant roadways and bridges in our region, and it would also map out all of the bicycle and pedestrian facilities in our region, as well as our technology assets, things like camera, fiber, those sorts of technology accessories on our area, mostly on our area highways, some on our arterials. And that would be programmed to take place next year in 2019. And then this Phase 2 project is sort of a placeholder at this point. It's really would really involve whatever's agreed upon to be the next step in this asset management initiative. It's scheduled for 2021, and would, of course, we would work with the board and Wampo committees in terms of developing a scope of what that next step might be, whether it's continual monitoring or figuring out some process to take this data that's collected and put it into the planning process, or something else, whatever that turns out to be. So again, that's $400,000 of Wampo funding, split about 180 on this first regional asset inventory, and then 220 on this Phase 2. So I did want to draw your attention to that project. It's a little bit non-routine for a TIP amendment. And then the last project for your consideration is a modification to an existing project. This is pretty routine. This is a project to replace some bridges on I-235 just north of West Street. KDOT just recently authorized construction and construction engineering cost for this, and so it bumped up the project cost estimate from $1 million to $10 million, exceeding our threshold for amendments. So, but pretty routine item. So with this amendment, we are meeting requirements. It's fiscally constrained, which means the projects in the TIP do not exceed the revenues that are projected to pay for them. It's consistent with our long-range plan, which is another federal requirement of ours. The TIP fees have been paid for those projects that require them. And then we also we always hold a 30-day public comment period on all of our TIP amendments, and we did not receive any comments about these except for the ones that we had collected on the pedestrian bridge through this other process. So with that, your TAC is recommending that you approve this TIP amendment as proposed. You do have some options on this amendment. So I'm glad to answer any questions you have on the projects that are part of this amendment.
That KDOT bridge project that went from 1 million to 10 million, is that solely funded by KDOT? I mean, I hear that and I'm like, wait a minute. So if you could just slightly go through that just a little bit.
Sure. Let me find it on here. In general, what happens with most of the KDOT projects is what goes into the TIP is what's been authorized by KDOT at that time. So they generally start with preliminary engineering, right-of-way, utility, relocation cost, and then it gets into preliminary construction engineering and construction. So oftentimes the KDOT projects continue to be amended as it goes through the approval process at KDOT, because there's no KDOT project in the TIP where the costs have not been authorized by KDOT to be spent.
So this isn't just a busted cost estimate. This is just kind of an upgrade to the process that hadn't been initially programmed in?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Well, it looks like it was 1,082,000 in the 18-19 year. And then it jumps to 9.5 million in 1920.
That's right. Let me find it here.
That change in number just really struck me.
Yeah, you're right.
So they're adding?
Yeah, that's right. You'll see it had originally just been a part of the preliminary engineering costs had just been in there. And then the construction and construction engineering costs are what are being added in this amendment.
It was PE and right away
Oh,
in
okay.
18 and 19, yeah.
It's fairly typical that you guys don't put the construction in until you're closer to the,
To characterize anything we do as typical, but in this particular
enough.
case, it's on the level.
okay, thank you. Just that jump just struck.
We still don't do them quite that poorly in terms of our
Okay.
estimates.
All right, thanks.
Questions? To approve Amendment 6.
So moved.
Ann and Jim, Al, to approve.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, motion carries.
Thank you.
Thank you. Committee and partnership status reports. We did not have an executive committee meeting last month, so there's nothing. Tom, do you have anything to tack?
On the TAC, item B and item C under new business, spent quite a bit of time on item B. The bridge was discussed for probably an hour. Had been on the 2040 plan and was in the list last year, got pulled, put back in, passed TAC. So that was our priority this month, so.
Thank you. Tom, 9 with the Department of Transportation.
We, last week, started a new project to inconvenience drivers on the west side again. This will be at K-96 and I-235, a necessary project. This is repairing a couple of bridges at that interchange. Mostly on K-96, it goes over I-235. Those bridges have had problems for years. Our maintenance crews constantly work on them, and this is an opportunity for a contractor to come in and do it in a more long-term fashion. The result of that is that we've got single lane traffic coming in from K-96 west, the Maze area, et cetera, coming into an area that they're used to having 2 lanes. They also travel in quite fast. because it is 70 miles an hour on that part of K-96. So there's a little bit of a bottleneck. So we've had a number of accidents in that first week during the learning curve. And also with one of the bridges being on the Meridian exit ramp, that ramp is closed. So eastbound K-96 to Meridian right now has a detour down to 25th Street, and then you come back up on northbound I-235 to access Meridian. So some inconvenience for drivers till about the end of November, most likely. There is also patching on the pavement in that area associated with those two bridges, and plus 8 ramps in that interchange will also be worked on, so we will see some ramp closures, and I don't have a schedule for that, so they will come out as the contractor knows that they're moving to the next one. We'll do the best we can to advise the public of that with message boards and press releases, but so look for a little bit more travel time if you use that area. Red project is progressing real nicely. We've got 3 new ramps that will open this fall, one in probably September. That would be northbound I-235 to westbound US 54. 2 others will open a month after that probably, and that will open all the ramps. So that project is progressing to the summer of 2019 finish in good fashion.
Appreciate your consistency of inconveniencing the drivers. I know, you're doing an excellent job.
It's that painful part during it, we all agree, I think, that it's
Yeah.
all good in the end, right?
Yeah, it'll be real good in the end. We do appreciate it. Okay, Mike Moriarty?
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. Last month, we talked briefly about the Joint Legislative Transportation Task Force that's currently underway. I did bring my handouts this month. The larger print is the roster of the 31-member task force. So if you're curious who's on this committee, this lays it out for you. I also brought a write-up on the task force itself. It also has a schedule of the planned 9 regional meetings, 2 of which are going to be kind of in this general area, October 4th in Newton and October 18th in Wichita. Certainly invite you all to attend those and any of the other ones you'd like to attend as well.
Thank you. Richard's not here. Other business before the board?
Mr. Chairman, I've got to apologize. I didn't catch this earlier on. I reflected in the minutes from the last meeting was Jim Weber as the representative for Sedgwick County Association of Cities, and I was here in that position, and I would like the minutes to be amended to reflect that, as well as putting Mr. Weber down in the other attendees. Much better looking and esteemed colleague who I can't imagine getting confused with me.
Got that? All right. Okay, there we go. She's got it. Got a minute. All right, we'll have that taken care of. Anything else? If not, we stand adjourned.